start with this. What do you think this is a picture of? Welcome, come on in, we're just starting. What does it look like?
Push and pull.
Yes, down the end?
Pulling both ways.
Yep, pulling both ways.
Conflict.
Yeah, why is it conflict?
Well, because there are two different sets of interests. So there's someone pulling at the horns of a cow and someone pulling at the tail. But also because there's someone, I guess, who is taking advantage of the conflict between the first two people.
Who's in the middle milking it? The lawyer. That's right. That's right. That's how we make our money. So I started my career as a litigator. And that's what I thought I wanted to do. I'd gone to it thinking that was going to help people. What I ultimately found through practicing law was that it's a bit like brain surgery with a hacksaw. Creates a lot more pain and mess than it actually solves in many, many cases. And that's when I went to study what we call alternative dispute resolution, which is mediation, negotiation, people taking responsibility for solving their own problems. And I became a professor in that area, and my textbooks are on boring equity and trust law, but this is the area that I now choose to work in. So my business is an international consultancy. In 2 weeks' time I'll be in Myanmar, setting up legal clinics there. There's a bit of conflict, you can imagine, going on in those countries at the moment. And most recently, and again I'll be there in February, the Kingdom of Bhutan, where I got to set up a model of mediation to underpin their new legal system that incorporated both Buddhism and gross national happiness, because of course it has to mirror and support the culture of the people who are using it. So conflict resolution is something I'm really committed to. It's something I know a little bit about, but all of you know just as much. You will know what has worked for you in the past. You will know what hasn't worked for you in the past. You will hopefully have come here today with some aspirations about something you'd like to know a little bit more about, and I'm hoping that we'll have that opportunity to work together too in the short time we have together. This picture, by the way, comes from a bus stop somewhere in Croatia or Serbia. This picture of the legal profession is so well, it's so well frequented around the world. It's everywhere. It's on English porcelain, it's on walls, it's in parchments and books. The public perception of lawyers is that we take advantage of other people's problems. And of course the smart thing to do would be for those two farmers to sort out their differences without all of the milk and the profit going to the lawyer in between. But that's a much easier thing to say than it is to do, because we humans have a whole bunch of stuff going on. Starting with a game. Everybody pair up. You need a person sitting next to you. So make sure you're sitting next to somebody and you have a table available. Come on, you guys down the back. There are no bludgers in this room. Come on down, sitting at a table, elbows on the table. Come on down. All right. Here are the rules of this game. You are both going to place your elbows on the table. You are going to clasp hands. The way you score a point in this game is if the back of your partner's hand touches the table. So that's how you score a point. Does everyone understand what I mean by that? Let's demonstrate that. So here, Richard, is it Richard? Could you hold my hand here and show everybody? So here, the way we would score a point is, no, don't fight me, is for me to put the back of Richard's hand down, or for Richard to place the back of my hand against the table, right? So that's what we're going to do. Your goal is to score as many points as you can in 1 minute. Everyone clear on the rules? Ready, set, go. And time's up. There were some valiant struggles in the room. Did you actually get 1 point, the couple down here? No. Here we go. No points at all in our minute. Anybody get 1 point? Yes. And you managed to overcome him? Yes. Yeah? You guys here? Equal. Equal points. Anybody get more than 10 points? Yeah, we did. Anybody get more than 20 points? Who got more than 30? Do you know how these people did it? The wise people in the middle of the room? Because they sat there, cooperated, and allowed each other to do it so that they continued to get equal points. And there were others. What's the point of that game? And don't feel bad if you were the people that struggled, because that is our natural reaction to that sort of a challenge. Culturally, that feeling that for us to win, they have to lose, is pretty much hardwired. A few years ago, the Australian Law Reform Commission asked us as legal academics to produce lawyers who were less adversarial. What a challenge. I started with them at 17 when we first got them to see if they had those instincts, and they already had them. I then went and did some work in high schools. When they started high school, they already had it. Went down to primary school. Anybody guess at what grade I had to go to find people who weren't already convinced that for them to win, someone else had to lose? Grade 4, yes. Yeah, but nobody won. The object of the game was to score as many points as you could. Oh, there you go. There you go. It's just an illustration. Please don't feel bad about it. You know, it's just an illustration. Clever. There you go. Because you got clever because he didn't get more than you.
No, I felt clever because we worked out, without talking about it, we worked out a way that there's nobody to lose.
No, you both lost, though, because the goal was to get as many points as you could. I'm sorry. Oh, all right. We'll agree to differ on that. And how often does that happen in life? And you'll find people in litigation where they will spend everything, lose their house, lose their relationship, lose everything, rather than lose and give up and settle. So it's a bit hardwired, and not in all circumstances you don't necessarily need to beat the other person. In fact, there's a whole lot of literature that suggests that the best outcome is the one that's fabulous for you that the other side can also live with. And that's what we're going to explore a little bit more about now. What I'd like to do now is get you to watch a very short clip, have a think about what takes you below the line. You'll find out.
Location, location, location. Brought to you by the Conscious Leadership Group. Find them on the web at www.conscious.is. Animation by Graham Franks. www.grahamfranks.com. One question that conscious leaders ask themselves over and over is, where am I? To support leaders in locating themselves as they ask the question, where am I? We offer this tool, a line, a simple black line. At any moment, all leaders and all people are either above the line or below the line. Our location describes how we're being with what is occurring in our life right now. If we are above the line, we are open, curious, and committed to learning. If we are below the line, we are closed, defensive, and committed to being right. Stop right now and simply ask yourself, where am I? In this now moment, am I above the line or below the line? Typically, when people are below the line, they believe certain things about the world. For example, they believe there is not enough. It could be that there's not enough money, or time, or space, or energy, or love. People below the line also believe that their story about the situation is right. People below the line also believe that there is a threat out there. Something or someone is threatening their desire for approval, control, or security. And people below the line see the situation as serious. The deeper below the line they are, the more serious things look. People below the line tend to behave certain ways as well. They tend to cling to an opinion, find fault and blame, gossip, explain, rationalize and justify, get overwhelmed, and avoid conflict or pursue conflict for the sake of winning. When people are above the line, they believe that learning and growing are more important than being right. They believe that all people and circumstances are their allies, here for their growth. They believe that from a distance, almost everything is funny. People above the line live in curiosity, listen deeply, speak unarguably, question all their beliefs, and live a life of play. Now, knowing what you know about being above or below the line, where are you? One thing to know as you consider this question. We are hardwired to go below the line. Literally, our brain is programmed to perceive threat, and when it does, a chemical cocktail courses through our veins, and we go below the line. This reaction was designed to help us survive in the presence of a real threat to our physical survival. An issue for modern-day leaders is that often our brains can't tell the difference between a threat to our physical survival and a threat to our ego or identity. We react and get defensive when we experience a threat to our ego. So in many ways, being below the line is natural and normal. But when we are below the line, we're not in a state, literally brain state, of high creativity, collaboration, innovation, and relational connection. We're simply trying to survive. Leaders today can't thrive if they're in survival mode. So the first activity of conscious leadership is location, location, location. In this now moment, where am I? Telling ourselves and others the truth about our current location begins the great conversation.
Does that feel true? So what takes you below the line? And that's a big, brave thing to answer. But I'm going to ask you to think about it, and think about it in the context of your own lives and your work lives and your lives at the station. What are the situations that take you below the line? And again, it's not judging. We all do it. It's a very human behaviour. But if you can start to observe the situations that take you there, you can start to put in place some strategies to help to keep yourself above it, or to help yourself to recognise that's where you're going, and to stop before you react and make things worse than they have to be. Some of the situations or scenarios that I discovered from talking to a couple of the association people before this session were perhaps a situation where other people in a station had a relationship, that relationship then soured, that then led to implications for everybody else trying to work with those people. Anybody come across that sort of scenario? And that can be very tricky, can't it? Because they've got a lot of emotions and feelings going on that are leading to behaviour that's not necessarily going to row the boat in the best direction for the entire organisation. Can they help it? No. But often what they need is a process, something like mediation, to allow them to vent all of that, explore what's gone wrong and come up with some agreements for the future. Management volunteers. Now, as I understand it, most of your stations are that scenario, and that's tricky for both of you. It's tricky to be a volunteer. You are trying to find time to do something you're passionate about and committed to. I run an organisation where I do a lot of pro bono work, and I understand how challenging that can be. But it's also challenging for management. Management has no way to ultimately discipline, sanction. They don't want to. They want to keep people enthusiastic and inspired and wanting to give to the organisation. So in your particular context, being able to communicate effectively around conflict, being able to open it up early, de-escalate it early and keep your relationships in a working order is going to be in everybody's best interests. Attention and recognition seekers, anybody seen anybody like that at work? The entertainment industry might have a few more than say the legal professional. No, I'm wrong. That's not right at all. Barristers are the ultimate attention seekers and recognition seekers. And that can be tricky, can't it, when somebody is continually trying to get attention and sometimes, like 2-year-olds, the negative attention is still better than no attention, and that can be tricky to manage. And the bottom one, high conflict personalities. Has anybody here had to come across or work with a high conflict personality? Do you know the statistics say that they are much more common out there in our community than people would realise? And of course, the challenge with that is that they actually need therapy to be able to deal with those issues. All we can do is not escalate high conflict personalities. If you and I are not a therapist, it's going to be very hard for us to have a conversation that opens up what's really driving them. But we can learn to not escalate. And I'm going to give you a few strategies for that again today, because when you are in that situation dealing with, for example, a type B cluster personality disorder narcissistic strain, and I used to be married to one, it can be really tricky because any feedback is perceived as personal attack. And it can be very, very difficult in a work context to move issues forward and to progress constructive dialogue around work when people are taking a personal reactive response. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and some of the strategies we'll cover today will extend to that situation. The thing to remember with high conflict personalities, and there's a lot written on this, and I can refer you to some books about it if you're interested after the session, is that a lot of high conflict personalities will actually choose what's known as a target of blame in their closer circle. And as a manager, that can be hard to spot. As managers, we often have the underlying belief that if there's a conflict, both sides are a little bit to blame. But in some of these situations, if someone has been chosen as a target of blame for a high conflict personality, there's nothing they can do right, and it's very hard for them to extract themselves. And they're going to need management's help if they're going to do that successfully. So the responsibility to be aware of when that might be going on, because the impact on people, the human impact on people, can be really quite serious. So, some of those scenarios, everyone in the room, I'd like you to have a think, because I want you to have a scenario in your head, because we're going to work on it towards the end of our session together. So think about a situation that has the potential to take you below the line. And the next thing to think about, I guess, is physically, when you are in that situation, do you react or do you respond? What's the difference? Yep.
Reaction is your spontaneous, holy crap. Respond is somewhat of a coordinated approach to having thought it through.
Absolutely. So react would probably be more below the line, and a response would be, I've looked at this, and this is where I'd like to intentionally. It still does, yeah. It certainly does. And feelings, those sorts of feelings come about because of our hard wiring. And we call it the amygdala hijack, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But this is what it looks like. If you're still struggling to find a situation, this is what it looks like. This is the sort of behaviour when people go into fight or flight. The anthropologists, I think it is, tell us that we have 4 instinctive reactions. An instinct is a reaction where you're walking down a path, you see something that looks like a snake, you jump out of the way, you haven't thought about it, you just instinctively reacted to it. And the anthropologists tell us we have 4 F responses: fight, flight, food, and reproduction. So in our fight and flight responses, here is the sort of behaviour that you're looking at. Some people will shout, slam doors, finger point, invade your personal space, hang up on you, and pick arguments. They're pretty obvious. But the other side is just as destructive. The silence, the walking away, the shutting down, seeking a defender on their behalf, refusing to act, being frozen, and avoiding to deal with the conflict altogether. If you're trying to run a business, that can be just as difficult to manage, can't it? Yep. And the impact on communication then, in the people around you, is they'll be insisting on their own way, criticising others, or bringing other people down, humiliating them. And flight, saying yes when they actually want to say no, playing the victim, or pleasing and pacifying others, which means that things don't actually get done or change doesn't happen. And where you often will encounter this sort of behaviour is when you're trying to change, because people's reaction to change is fear, threat, and they go back into that reptilian response. Fight and flight can be just as bad, where people deliberately make mistakes to slow you down, or that last one, the sabotage. Yes, we're going to do that. No, we don't. And it can be really tricky to work out where it's happening. Any of that ring a bell? So they're the sorts of behaviours that you're finding when people are going below the line. A completely normal human thing for us and for them to do. No criticism here, it's just how we operate. To bring yourself above that and intentionally behave differently, that's the masterclass. And how do you do it? What's the secret? How do you respond to people who are behaving badly and are in fight and flight mode? One of the wisest things I think I've ever learned in my time as both a lawyer and as an educator is that people who are behaving badly, who are threatening, who are yelling, who are aggressive in their gestures, are behaving that way because they are actually feeling out of control themselves. They are actually in their fear space, and they are doing this like a puffer fish to puff themselves up to appear bigger and stronger and more in control because they are frightened or fearful. Whether it's a real issue or an ego issue is completely different, but that's why they're doing it. And the most important thing to remember is that powerful people don't threaten, they act. A powerful person wouldn't stand there and threaten to do something. A powerful person wouldn't need to because they would have the resources at their disposal to leave the room and act. So if somebody is threatening you, your intuitive response is that they have a lot of power and you're frightened, and the intentional response is actually they're feeling out of control. How can I help them to feel more powerful in this situation and less threatened by me or whatever I represent so that I can get more reasonable behaviour out of them? How does that sound? Counterintuitive, yeah?
There is always the exception.
Oh yes, absolutely, there is always the exception.
Not a rule, that is a good portion of those people, but there's still that proportion that do it deliberately because they have a particular agenda to achieve.
Yep, absolutely. Contrived conflict to achieve another agenda. And they don't want to resolve the conflict, not at all. The conflict is their way of gaining attention, traction, or influence, whatever it is, absolutely. And being aware of that is important because you can spend hours putting people through a process trying to resolve a conflict that is insoluble. And as managers, that's just another one of the superpowers you have to learn along the way. And you test out your instincts by putting them through something like mediation to see if it's possible to resolve. And when the goalposts continue to change and the story continues to change just as you come to a point where it should resolve, that's your best indicator that that's what's going on. So there's our brain, our caveman brain. And we talked a bit about the amygdala hijack. And what happens with the brain is that the reptilian part is back here. That's what I like to call a caveman brain. That's our reptilian, the first part of the brain. And then it evolved through to the, frontal cortex. That's what I like to call our Nelson Mandela, yeah? And what happens when we go into amygdala hijack is all of the blood and energy is hijacked by the back of the brain. And it's actually really hard for the blood to get through to the frontal part, the neocortex, for poor old Nelson Mandela to have any say on what would be an appropriate way to respond. How do you stop, or how do you get yourself out of amygdala hijack?
Take a break.
Breathe. Say nothing at all until poor old Nelson Mandela's had a chance to look at the situation. Because if you're reacting instantaneously, you're probably reacting from here, your reptilian brain. And to slow down, breathe, and say nothing at all can be your biggest ally in any situation where you're being threatened or feeling that there's a conflict about to erupt. There's a wise old Chinese proverb, a closed mouth gathers no feet. Try to keep that one in mind. You can't make a mistake if you're actually saying nothing at all and breathing. And what you are doing is making sure that you aren't operating from your caveman, you're operating from your Nelson Mandela. Then the trick for us, of course, is to try to work out what we can do with the other person to get them out of their caveman and also operating through their Nelson Mandela. Because if we can effectively do that by calming them down and allaying their fear, we have a much greater chance, unless they are the exceptional high conflict personality or contrived conflict person, we have a much better chance with the average person to get a more constructive problem-solving dialogue going on to solve the conflict, or at least not escalate it. Does that make sense? I mean, that's a very simplistic version of the science, but that's basically what's going on. And remember, it's not dinosaurs anymore that are our threat. In the olden days, it was threat to our survival that led to this amygdala hijack. All the blood stopped, and instinctively we reacted with adrenaline. But in our modern world, it's often just it's a threat to our ego. What's our ego? Yep, personality. It's our story of ourselves, isn't it? It's the bit that needs to look like a winner, to know, to look good, and to be right. Because if we aren't those things, it's very difficult for us to tell a story about ourselves that we like. So whenever we are in a situation of conflict, or trying to communicate with someone, or trying to negotiate with someone, and I teach negotiation skills, and that's really where you find it, the ego gets in the way of the wisest solution in a lot of cases. So if you're trying to negotiate something with someone that's important to you, being conscious of what story they're likely to be telling about the situation is probably your best weapon. Because if you can find a way to use your words and frame your proposals so that it's easy for them to see how they will be a winner at the end by accepting your proposal, you are far more likely to move forward. That story of self, how do I tell a story about what we're doing here that makes me look like a winner? Most people go into their negotiations thinking about how they're going to come out a winner. The real secret to a successful negotiation is spending more time thinking about how you're going to help the other person to feel like a winner, because then they're not going to be resisting and fighting so much. They'll be in an open-minded space because you're helping them to look like a winner. You'll get a lot more Nelson Mandela out of them. So, ego, that story of self. And if you think back to the scenarios we talked about before at the station, ego is often behind most of it. It's not a physical survival threat. It's a how do I manage to save my face in this situation and tell a story about myself that's consistent with who I want to appear to be to the world. Does that make sense? Okay, so there's our formula. To go from a bristling caveman, ABC, to DEF, we try to de-escalate fear. First, we do it with ourselves, and that's that strategy of breathing, listening, and not reacting, but responding. Do you know listening is the one skill that most people could do better? I talk to my law students, who's a good communicator? I am, I did Youth Speaks for Australia, I was debating captain, I spoke at the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games, I spoke here, I spoke there, but nobody thinks about how important it is to listen. And if you're trying to solve a problem with somebody, if you're trying to get an understanding with somebody, the solution is going to be through learning what their story of themselves is and what they want to achieve. You aren't going to learn anything if you're talking. In fact, when we're talking, all we hear is what we already know, which doesn't help. It's not a problem-solving approach. So stopping and listening is your best key to discovering the extra stuff that's going to perhaps help you to solve the problem. Within limits, we haven't got hours to sit and listen to people rant about things, and sometimes you need to direct it down, but listening can be incredibly therapeutic just on its own. It certainly can help to get them out of the caveman, because if you aren't attacking back, if you're sitting there and actually listening to what they have to say, all the research says that they will calm down, they will probably slow down, and they will probably change their language to something a little less threatening. And that's got to help you in terms of moving the issue forward. Does that make sense? Any experiences of that? I'm sure there's many in the room. Anyone got teenagers? Who hasn't got teenagers? They're the happy-looking people. So, how do we de-escalate fear? And there's a whole body of research around this. The way that we de-escalate fear and get people out of the caveman is by building trust. And you can do a whole course on strategies and communication skills to build trust. In workplaces, if you can build a trust culture, then you are going so far towards having a really creative and productive and collaborative workplace, which is, of course, what we would all aspire to. So building trust is something that has commanded quite a bit of attention in the last few years in terms of leadership theory as well as management theory. There's a fellow called Dr. James Doty, and he was a neurosurgeon, and he now leads a project at Stanford around this particular sort of leadership. And what he says is that a lot of people think that to build trust and to have a culture in your organisation that supports people and mentors people takes too much time. They think their job is too hard-nosed, too immediate and urgent. They haven't got time to manage other people's mistakes that way. So I'd like you to have a think, what happens at your station if somebody makes a mistake? And you don't have to say it here, but it's the real litmus test of what sort of culture you have. Because what happens often if someone else makes a mistake and we think that mistake is going to make us look bad, is going to have implications for us. We go into our caveman, we go into amygdala hijack, we get angry, we get frustrated, and we want that person to never make that mistake again, so we punish them in a way. And there's all sorts of ways of doing that. What's the alternative approach? Yes?
What I did when volunteers made a mistake was go in and listen to it, go in and ask her, because I didn't know her, so I went in and got to know her a bit, and she knew she'd done something wrong, so that was a good start.
Fantastic. In fact, you probably wrote the next box on this slide. Well done. Choose a compassionate response. They know they've made a mistake. And then they're not destroyed, and they want to improve, and you get them on your team for the future. Doty tells a story about his first time in surgery. He's got his cap on, he's got his gown on, he is so excited and so nervous. And he is standing there with the other residents who are learning, and the big-wig surgeon comes in. Anybody ever met too many big-wig surgeons? Do you know a big-wig surgeon? There's a bit of ego going on there. And he is all gowned up under these incredibly bright lights, and what happens is the unspeakable. A drop of perspiration falls from his forehead onto the operating site. And he says, in retrospect, that could have easily been irrigated. It was never a threat to the patient, but what the surgeon did was scream at him, abuse him, and throw him out of the room. And when he left that room, he was absolutely devastated. He couldn't imagine how he was ever going to become a doctor. And he'd spent how many years to train for that opportunity? And he went home and he cried, tears of devastation about the fact that he'd just blown his entire life and he was never going to be able to do it. And he says now, what if that doctor had taken a different approach? What if that doctor had said, listen, son, go outside and calm yourself down, and I understand you're nervous, but you can't afford to be that nervous in an operation. And when you come back in, retie your hat the way I have. See how I've tied it? That actually catches the perspiration. Take a few deep breaths, calm yourself down, and when you come in, come and have a look at this surgery, because that's what you're here to learn. If he had taken that approach, Doty says that he would have had his undying loyalty for the rest of his career. And that's really the situation we're faced with every day when someone around us makes a mistake. Because if we choose to not react and we choose to respond that way, then we have an ally forever and a much more collaborative potential in our future. Henry Ford is famous for saying, don't find a fault, find a remedy. And there's a great story about Watson Sr., who ran IBM. You might have heard it. In the 50s, he had a young, new university graduate who was an absolute shining star who made a big mistake, and it cost multi-millions of dollars. Now, in the 50s, that was a lot of money. And this young graduate sitting in his office, and he's shaking in his shoes, and he gets a call, the big boss wants to see you. So he wanders up to the big boss's office, and he nervously says, yes, sir, respectfully, sir, I suppose, sir, that I'm here because you're going to fire me. And Watson's renowned for turning around and saying, fire you? Fire you? After all the money I just spent on your education? And you know, that's a true story, and it is the way to look at it. Mistakes are an opportunity to build the sort of culture you want, get that trust going so that it's going to be easier into the future. How do we do that in a conversation? Fisher and Shapiro are a couple of professors from Harvard, and they've done quite a bit of research on what drives people. And there are all sorts of research books about this, but they've come up with this very helpful table. They call these human beings' core concerns. These are the concerns that if they're not being met, we're likely to go into fear mode and defensive mode. If they are being met, we're likely to become more trusting and open. So in managing those situations with the people around you, if those core concerns aren't being met for you or for somebody else in your organisation, that's how you're likely to feel and behave. If they are being met, then you're going to be feeling a lot more trusting, open and satisfied with your position. What do they mean? What does appreciation mean? What does it mean to you to be appreciated at work? Feeling valued, absolutely. Harvard set up a love lab to experiment with this. It was full of newlyweds. Anybody in the room a newlywed? Yes, congratulations. So they took the newlyweds aside and they wired them up to and got them to tell a story. And they asked them to tell a story about a conflict that they had had recently with their partner. And they were to try to not go too much into the feelings of it again, not who was right or wrong, but just describe it. And as a result of that research, they then did longevity studies over which relationships stayed together and which relationships didn't. And they found, amongst all of this research, that there is a magic ratio of appreciative comments to constructive feedback that is necessary for a long-term relationship. That is the number of positives, appreciative comments you would need to make to somebody to balance out constructive feedback that would mean that they would stay committed to the relationship and the relationship would stay strong and trusting. What do you think the ratio is? Sorry? That's exactly it. Give that lady a gold star. Well done. What's your name? Hi, Sam. Yeah. 5-to-1. That's the magic ratio. And they said that relationships where it was 1-to-1, they didn't last very long. And that wasn't because of the negative, because everybody needs to have feedback in their life and needs to be able to deal with feedback. It was the absence of the positive. It was the absence of the appreciative statements to balance that up. So that's what... Sorry? Sorry? Yes, kiss, slap, kiss. Yeah, absolutely. Not that we're advocating any slapping, that is metaphorical slapping. So appreciation, that's what we mean by that. Think about the amount of appreciative things you say to the people around you. And could you say more? And what would you lose by it? Affiliation, what does that mean? Absolutely, another gold star. You guys didn't need me here today. These guys could have done it. Okay, so affiliation. What would you think would be the most challenging negotiation situation you could think of? How about hostage negotiation? So, true story. We are in a New York subway, and there is a young man who is 26 years of age who suffers from delusions of grandeur. He really believes he's been put on the earth to save everybody from demons. There are angels and demons all around us. They're all in disguise, and he's here to save everybody. He's in the subway. He sees a 20-year-old new mother. He grabs the baby, pushes the mother on the tracks, and goes and locks himself in a storage room. This is a true story. So he's in the storage room, and the people around are terrified, and they're all gathering around the door and calling security, calling the police, calling the hostage negotiation squad. And he's in this room saying, if you're an angel, I'll love you. But if you're a demon, I know what I have to do. And you can imagine how terrified. This mother is sitting outside thinking, this monster's in there with my baby. How are we going to change the situation? The security guard tried his best whilst he was waiting for the professionals and said, oh, but the baby's an angel. And the guy said, well, how do we know? They all look the same. How do I know that the baby's an angel and not a demon? So that was too superficial and obviously wasn't going to work. This guy took his job seriously. When the hostage negotiators came, they had done a little bit of research, as much as they could, on his history, because he obviously had a mental health history, and worked out that he believed it was his job to save the world. So the negotiator said through the door, well, mate, it sounds like we've got a lot in common. I mean, we don't see angels and demons like you do, but these blokes and I, we spend every day trying to make the world a better place, trying to get rid of the bad guys and trying to make the world a better place. We understand. Within 2 minutes, he opened the door and came out. So that he stopped being defensive and started to trust that other people would help him with what it was he wanted to achieve. There was an affiliation in their cause. And Shapiro tells this story, that true story, as an example of one of the most challenging, I guess, stressful situations, to try to find an affiliation with someone you would think it would be a bit difficult to do it with. So if you're all working in community radio and you've all got the best interests of your organisation at heart, then you probably are in a better place than that hostage negotiator to find something to build your affiliation with your co-workers, even the tricky ones. Autonomy, status and role. People's autonomy is very important to them, isn't it? Your ability to determine what you're going to do for yourself. And then when that's threatened, we react. Status, very important. Role. Role is particularly important for volunteers where they perceive that their other important roles in their life are going to be affected by something they're being asked to do as a volunteer. Does that resonate? Yeah. So that's something to be particularly careful with, I would have thought, in the context of your organisations, that role threat. There it is. So, the application of that, and what I'd like you all to do in your own time tonight, after this session, is to have a think about who do you clash with at work. Write down the situation and then have a think about what could I say next time that might help to deal with those aspects for the other person, not for you. What could you say? I really appreciate how much time you're giving the station. Appreciate how long you've been involved with the station. It needs to be sincere. Insincerity can be detected a mile off. And it doesn't have to have all of those things. But 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of them, you might be able to find something good to say. They're not a psycho that's taken a baby. They're your co-worker that needs lots of appreciation to feel that they're being valued, so you can get them operating from their Nelson Mandela. And if you're having difficulty managing them, the smart thing for you is to try to help them to get there as best you can. Does that make sense? We haven't got time to do it together today, but if you could all find a scenario, have a think about that and what you would say, that would be really, really helpful for you. And then maybe share it with other people at your station, people who know the situation you're facing. Do you think this would work? Would this be perceived as sincere and helpful? But I go through this exercise with people very frequently. And when we start to practice being more appreciative in our vocabulary to the people around us, we notice difference. Particularly people that we have thought we had a natural clash with and we're never going to get along with. You will, if you try this, I suspect you will be surprised about how quickly some people defrost and the amount of traction you can make by taking a step backwards, not reacting, and saying something appreciative back to the person that is threatening you. What if that doesn't work? This is not the United States. Apart from shoot them, what's the process that's recommended by the CBAA for conflicts? Yeah? What's the process? Mediation. Yeah, mediation. I actually teach mediation as well. I've been a mediator for a long time. I understand some people don't have confidence in that process. Can anyone tell me why? Yeah?
People aren't honest. Mediation process.
Yep. So if they're telling lies, then any negotiated agreement is going to be based on lies and it's not going to be useful. Absolutely.
People don't like opening up in front of strangers and admitting that they may have done something wrong.
Yes, people don't like that. They need to save face. And in mediation, the way that we do it, there are private meetings as well as joint sessions. And what I will find if I've got somebody that is digging themselves into a hole and they're going to lose face is I'll have a private session and explore that issue with them in a safe way that allows them to go back into the room having saved face so they can keep moving forward. It's not in anybody's best interest to trap them and rub their nose in it, but it is good for them to acknowledge it and to acknowledge that that's what's got in the way of the relationship. Absolutely. Yeah?
I think also, I guess as a very junior member of staff formally, it's very tricky when the power imbalance is very sustained, because I think that really cements some of the stuff that you were saying, that, you know, like someone who's quite senior, who's in the board, who has been a manager for many years, like, yeah, sure, let's do this, no worries, you know, I have all the time to waste, I can waste all of your time, but it, you know, like, yeah, in the absence, I think of, I guess, ethical leadership, which can happen, you know, not necessarily speaking about my own organisation, but, you know, a general remark. I think in the absence of committed and ethical leadership, mediation, I think, can have very limited value.
It's well documented that where there is a power imbalance, mediation is challenged. If it can't be redressed, if the mediator can't redress the power imbalance and convince both sides that they can negotiate as equals and create a platform for you to negotiate as equals, it can be very tricky. But a lot of mediators can do that, and they can do that by realising that people have different sources of power. You might be a volunteer and you don't have any sanction power, but that person needs you all to keep working or that station doesn't run. So people bring different sources of power into the room, and experienced mediators are able to work with that and redress that and to reframe things in a way that helps people to see they both have leverage and it's in both of their best interests to move forward. And I wouldn't be your mediator, but I would think that if you've dismissed it out of hand from having heard things from other people that say it doesn't work, give it another try with a good professional mediator, because you have all the power. You don't have to agree to anything. At the end of the day, you will only get an agreement if you think it's a good idea. The mediator has no power to make a decision. All they do is facilitate a conversation to try and get some of the ego out and some of the reaction out, I'm coming to you, so that you can then come up with a solution yourself. And often people haven't thought about the other side's perspective at all until they get into that room and have somebody, a professional communicator, create a space where they actually have to listen for a little while. The mediator will create a space for you to be heard in a way you've never been heard by that person before. And that, I think, is the superpower of mediation, to have a think about. Yes?
It would also be pointless if one of the parties didn't feel there was a problem.
Oh, yes.
Or was unaware that there was a problem.
Mm. Yeah, and when that happens in a mediation, I'll take that person into the other room and say, well, the reason that we're here is there clearly is an obstacle that needs to be jumped. Your association has called me in. And if we don't come up with a solution, if you don't come up with a solution today, you'll walk out with that same problem. And if it's not mediation next time, perhaps it will be disciplinary proceedings. Yeah? There's always a reality test. And I would love to have lots more after this, but I've been on strict orders. We have to finish on time. So can we talk about it after the session? That would be great. So mediation is a possibility, and I've got a lot of faith in the process. And what I want to leave you with, to make sure that we do finish on time, is a story to take away. And it's a story about an Arabian father. And this father loved his 3 sons very much and was trying to work out what to do with his estate when he died. And he decided he'd give half of his estate to his eldest boy, because his eldest boy was going to have the most responsibility managing the family. He'd give 1/3 of his estate to his second son, because he also would have a bit of the burden. But he'd only give 1/9 of his estate to his youngest son, because his youngest son was probably going to get a bit of a free ride on the coattails of the other 2. When the father died, his estate comprised 17 camels. The sons sat there and scratched their heads. We can't divide it by 2, we can't divide it by 3, we can't divide it by 9. It's a hopeless number. They had to talk about, could they kill some of the camels and use the meat, but their father wouldn't have wanted that. They could try and breed more camels, but who'd know which camels that were bred were actually owned by which brother and who the parents were and what if they died. And they got very, very caught up in their potential solutions. So they went to the village wise man and said, what do we do? How do we solve this? And he sat there and had to think about it and heard from the boys and said, this is a bit too tricky for me. But down the street there's a Community Broadcasting Association member, and they've done some real conflict resolution training recently, and I think they're pretty wise about what solutions you can come up with, so go and ask them. So the sons wandered down to the CBAA representative and told their sad story, and the CBAA rep sat there and listened very carefully and said, tricky problem you've got here, boys. And I don't know what I can say to you, but I do know I've got a camel out the back myself. And she's alone out there and not really fulfilling any function for me, so I feel for you. So what I'd like to do is say, well, would you like to take my camel with you when you go? Can't solve your problem, but I can give you my camel. And the boy said, that's it. We now have 18 camels. 18 divided by 2 is 9, and then 18 divided by 3 is 6. 9 and 6 is 15, and then 18 divided by 9 is 2. 9, 6, 2. That's 17. You can have your camel back. What we do when we take a measured, responsive approach to conflict is we open up the perspective of people who believe that they only have one solution and they believe that they can't make things work. You open their perspective, help them to see that they have more, and they will invariably come up with a solution to divide what they actually already have. So good luck with all of that. It's not easy, but it's absolutely worthwhile. And conflict resolution skills training is something I would recommend to all of you. It just makes your life more pleasant. Thanks.